Welcome to this week's show, ladies and gentlemen. By the time you're reviewing or listening to this week's episode, my family and I will have landed at the, for now, undisclosed location for our vacation. I'm looking forward to what I expect will be a great week of relaxation and good food. Most of all, it will be time spent together with my family away from the hustle and bustle of everyday life, where we would get to enjoy each other's company. I have to tell you, though, taking a vacation once a year for the past couple of years now is kind of odd. When I was on active duty, the vacations were few and far between. Don't get me wrong, I'm not complaining, quite the opposite. I enjoy getting away from the homestead and not for my consulting work, and especially when I have my bride at my side. There's just something different for me. Longtime listeners may recall my bride and I, along with my mother, went on a quick vacation last year around this time. Well, it was actually in December, but Denise got to enjoy her birthday in two different European countries last year. And we also checked off one of the locations on my mom's bucket list. Speaking of vacation, you would not believe the rigmarole that I'm going through right now with both the travel agency and the travel insurance company in dealing with the cancellation of the Holy Land trip. It's almost as bad as dealing with the government. I say almost because at least I get to speak to a real person instead of a government bureaucracy telephone prompt that just turns into a circular firing squad that keeps you in an endless logic loop, pushing the same buttons over and over and listening to the same computer generated voice. But this situation is quite troubling to me in a way that is different than what you may be thinking. While I'm doing okay enough financially to have patience in trying to get my refund, I can only imagine how bad this is hitting some of the 75 plus travelers on this trip, especially those that are fixed income retirees. Let me tell you, folks, that pilgrimage was not cheap, especially for four people traveling. It has not hit me bad financially, mainly because I had paid the travel agency for the land only portion of the trip. That's because I wanted to book the air travel separately for my tribe so that I can upgrade my seating on what was scheduled to be a 15-hour nonstop flight from Atlanta to Tel Aviv. As I said, that turned out to be a great decision because Delta Airlines was very responsive and quick to refund the cost of the plane tickets. The land portion, though, was still a significant chunk of money because, like I said, I was paying for four people. For the people in our group that book both the land and air portions for the trip with the travel agency, based upon what I'm experiencing, they are in for a long wait while things get sorted out. You know the old saying about hindsight being 2020? That is turning out to be true in this case. A good friend that was going on this trip with us decided to look up the reviews for the travel agency the church was using for this trip. Keep in mind, this was the same travel agency that our church used in the past on many occasions. In fact, it was the same one used when Denise and I traveled with the church to the Holy Land in November of 2019. Based upon that previous experience, as well as the church using this travel agency for all of its previous excursions to Israel, we did not do a deep dive on the company's reviews. Well, that turns out we should have. There are a ton of negative reviews about this company. And based upon those reviews and what is happening with the current situation, I do not believe I will ever again travel to the Holy Land with my church if they continue to use this travel agency. My wife and I will find some other way to get my daughter and son-in-law to the Holy Land in the future. But I still feel really bad for those that did not buy the travel insurance for this trip. It's not looking too good for those people to recoup the cost of the pilgrimage because the travel agency's policy is to issue travel credits, not refunds, for trips that are canceled in the event of war or acts of terrorism. I want to remind the audience about next week's special guest. On November the 13th, the Iron Lady of the Tennessee Senate will be joining the Liberty Leadership and Lies show to discuss her upcoming bill in the General Assembly that seeks to protect my fellow Tennesseans from the ever and growing overreach of the communist central government in Washington, D.C. It would be remiss of me if I did not mention that the companion bill on the House side of the General Assembly is being sponsored by Representative Bud Hulsey. As we discuss the topic of liberty today, I want to remind the listeners to support those individuals that have a verifiable track record of defending our liberty, as well as those organizations that work to protect the citizens' liberty. People like the Iron Lady of the Tennessee Senate, Senator Janice Bowling, and organizations like the Tennessee Firearms Association. If you have not signed up to receive their newsletter, you can do so by visiting their website, TennesseeFirearms.com. Again, that is TennesseeFirearms.com. Oh, and another reminder, Actually, it's a tip that comes from one of the show's followers on Rumble. If you are watching the video version of this podcast on Rumble or YouTube, be sure and give the show a thumbs up on those platforms. I would really appreciate it. You can also rate the audio version of the show on Apple or Spotify. Now, before we move on, I want to just update the audience on my mother-in-law, Joanne. She's still not doing very well, and it's not going to get any better. So I continue to ask for your prayers. Well, that's enough of a recap of the past week. This week, I'm going to be speaking about a part of my oath to the Constitution. Really, everybody that serves our nation in a public capacity, their oath to the Constitution, and some very specific words in these oaths. So stay tuned and let's get on with this week's program. Welcome to a show where we will discuss how the citizens of this republic must continuously fight to maintain our liberty. And those fights are increasingly against our own government. Some of the episodes on liberty will shine a light on exactly how all levels of government are seeking to erode our constitutionally protected rights. We will also discuss the leadership needed to restore our constitutional republic, as well as providing examples of good and bad people in leadership positions in all facets of our society. Additionally, we will discuss the lies the people in positions of power and influence spread every day so they can maintain those same positions. I'm your host, Larry Linden, retired U.S. Navy veteran, small business owner, and candidate for the Tennessee House of Representatives, and this is the Liberty, Leadership, and Lies podcast. All right, folks, as I said in the introduction to this week's episode, we're going to talk about the oath to the Constitution of the people, not only those that serve in the military, but also the oath that people elected to serve in public office at the local, state, and federal level, the oath they take when voluntarily entering into service to our nation. The oath I swore when I first enlisted in the United States Navy nearly 4 decades ago, and reaffirmed again on several reenlistments over my 30-year career, has some key words that bear directly on the title of this week's episode. I have titled this show, Liberty, Enemies, Foreign and Domestic. In fact, the first part of the oath of enlistment that I swore on multiple occasions is as follows. I, Lawrence Robert Linton II, do solemnly swear that I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic, that I will bear true faith and allegiance to the same. I left the closing part of the oath of enlistment out simply because the closing is slightly different than other oaths that people swear. That is because the nature of whatever organization, be it the local mayor's office, school board, county commissioner, state representative or senator, state governor, or even congressional rep or senator, and even the president of the United States, each of those levels of service to the state or nation has different functions and slightly different words in the ending of their oaths of office. But they are similar in that they mention supporting and defending or upholding the Constitution of the United States of America. As I mentioned, though, when trying to come up with the theme for this week's show on the topic of liberty, I thought back to the many of the previous shows on the topic of liberty, where I frequently discussed the ways in which it is attacked. So that also got me to thinking, gee, imagine that, right? And it is something that I believe that I innately understand, but I don't think a lot of people grasp the following concept. If my liberty, our liberty, is under attack, that means liberty has an enemy. In a bit of foreshadowing here, let me ask you this question. For the past century or so in our republic, what institution or group of people has conducted the most attacks on our liberty? I mean, each of us, every citizen in our country, we all have the same right to liberty. That concept is captured in our nation's Declaration of Independence, where it states, quote, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." So when our liberty is attacked, our right to it is being denied by something, right? that something or someone, by definition, is an enemy of yours and my rights, an enemy of liberty, and therefore an enemy of the Constitution. Dictionary.com defines enemy as a person who feels hatred for, fosters harmful designs against, or engages in antagonistic activities against another, an adversary, or an opponent. Pretty straightforward there, don't you think? So it stands to reason that we all have an enemy. Yes, even the people that just want to be left alone. We all have an enemy that fosters, heck, not only fosters, but enacts harmful designs against the liberty that our Creator endowed us with. The same liberty that the founding fathers fought so hard to obtain for us and to pass along to us with the protections written into our Constitution. I've talked about this on this program many times before, of the importance in not only taking an oath, but also of upholding an oath. Just what kind of person hates liberty then? Well, definitely communists and their big government supporters. They're useful idiots. They hate liberty and freedom and want to sit at the top of the power structure of what they radically transform our republic into. I also realize that not everybody in this country, they take an oath, which is sort of surprising to me, but although not really. No natural born citizen in the United States of America takes an oath unless they serve in public office. But did you know that when you or any other person becomes a naturalized citizen in the United States of America, that they have to take an oath? That's just wild to me. Along with a requirement to pass a citizenship test that deals a lot with questions about our Constitution and form of government. A test that probably no public school graduate could pass right now, and probably many college graduates as well. But let me share with you what that oath that a person must take upon becoming a naturalized citizen. It states, I hereby declare on oath that I absolutely and entirely renounce and abjure all allegiance and fidelity to any foreign prince, potentate, state, or sovereignty of whom or which I have heretofore been a subject or citizen, that I will support and defend the Constitution and laws of the United States of America against all enemies, foreign and domestic, that I will bear true faith and allegiance to the same, that I will bear arms on behalf of the United States when required by law, that I will perform non-combatant service in the armed forces of the United States when required by law, that I will perform work of national importance under civilian direction when required by law, and that I take this obligation freely without any mental reservation or purpose of evasion, so help me God. Wow. Now, there are a couple of allowable modifications to that oath that are written in the law. One being that verifiable conscientious objectors can leave out the part about taking up arms, or the words on oath can be substituted with the words solemnly affirm, and so help me God can also be left out, but if you imagine that. Still, that oath is a pretty positive declaratory statement for a person that voluntarily seeks to become a U.S. citizen. And it goes into much more detail even than the oath I swore for service in the armed forces. It is definitely more stringent than the oaths people take for elected office. I mean, compare the citizenship oath of office that I just read to the oath of office for the current governor of Tennessee, Bill Lee. That oath states this: I, William Byron Lee, do solemnly swear that as a governor of the state of Tennessee, that I will support the Constitution of the state of Tennessee and the Constitution of the United States, and that I will perform with fidelity and faithfully execute the duties of the office of the governor to which I have been elected and which I'm about to assume to the best of my skill and ability, so help me God. Now, that oath, it seems so lackluster as compared to the oath that the newly naturalized citizen swears, doesn't it? Well, maybe that's why we get such a lackluster performance out of Governor Lee. Or maybe he is following his oath perfectly because the best of his skill and ability is not quite up to the task, or that his skills and ability more closely align with Democrat or communist skills and abilities, and not as the Republican he was elected to be. Anyway, the point of this first segment is about oaths and how each one for public service in our republic has words about supporting and defending the Constitution of the United States of America. If these public officials at the local, state, and federal level, as well as high ranking members of the military, heck, every member of the military, if they all take this oath, why are the enemies to our liberty so successful in their efforts at fostering harmful designs against or engages in antagonistic activities against liberty here in the United States of America? Why do we enjoy less liberty, less freedom today than other citizens of the United States did 150 years ago? Why is it that our children and grandchildren will enjoy less freedom than we did growing up? I'm sure that might be puzzling to some people, but we're going to discuss why the enemies are successful and what type of enemy is the most successful. Is it the foreign ones or the domestic ones? We'll do that right after this short break, so stay tuned. Okay, folks, we're back. Now that we've discussed oaths to the Constitution and how everybody that serves in public office, along with everybody that serves in the military and those that want to become a naturalized citizen, they must swear these oaths. We must drill down on how that relates to the erosion of liberty in our constitutional republic. The main theme that I want all of us to take away from these oaths is that a person must voluntarily take them. It is known to everybody that enters into military or volunteer service in public, or even those naturalized citizens. It is known that they must swear an oath to support and defend the Constitution of the United States of America. Also, keep in mind that the Constitution is not a roadmap for the government to grant or deny people rights. The Constitution, along with our Declaration of Independence, acknowledges that our rights are unalienable, self-evident, and come from our Creator. They definitely don't come from the government. Our founding fathers understood this when they created that document. There are even some modern elected officials that understand that, none more so than United States Senator from Kentucky, Senator Rand Paul. Some of the best quotes about the Constitution can be attributed to him. I'll give you a couple. First one being, the founders never intended for Americans to trust their government. Our entire Constitution was predicated on the notion that government was a necessary evil to be restrained and minimized as much as possible. The manner in which our government has behaved, though, over the past 3+ years makes that sentiment more relevant than ever now. Or how about this next one from Senator Paul? The Constitution was not written to restrain the citizens' behavior. It was written to restrain the government's behavior. Is that the case anymore, though? Who is more restrained in our society today, government or the citizen? I'm getting way too far ahead of myself. I first want to discuss the foreign enemies that some oaths call for people that swear them to support and defend the Constitution against. Just who are they? When I was on active duty, we would often receive briefings about enemies or adversaries and what was referred to as the 4+1. It was stated in that manner because the 4 represented sovereign nations and the +1 represented international terrorist and crime organizations. The 4 nations were Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran. The +1 was always ephemeral because it could encompass the flavor of the moment. Anyway, during my time on active duty, the +1 covered Al-Qaeda, ISIS, and the international drug lords in one convenient package. But when I come to think about the 4+1 package now, are we the people being told the entire truth about who exactly the foreign enemy or enemies truly are? Have any of those 4 nation states taken any overt actions against the United States of America? Sure, there's a whole bunch of saber rattling going on in the international arena, but are there any overt combat actions being undertaken by those 4 nations? We all know that Iran is the largest exporter and state sponsor of terror organizations on the planet. But have there been any attacks by those 4 countries directly on the homeland? None that I'm aware of, which, when you come to think about it, shows some admirable restraint on the part of Russia because of the proxy war we are engaged in with them in the Ukraine conflict. And that's probably because Russia recognizes that the United States is really just engaged in the largest money laundering operation in the history of the planet over there. Otherwise, I'm sure there would be much more severe retaliations. In fact, I believe that every nation that is involved in the conflict in Ukraine right now, this includes Russia, is using the whole thing to launder their citizens' money. So, my position right now, especially studying not only the machinations of the central planners in DC, in addition to the actual actions by those four nation states, I believe they have the potential to be our foreign enemies, but they're not our actual enemies at this time. There are no declared hostilities with those nations. In fact, as I have mentioned on this program before, when discussing the enumerated powers of the national government, there has not been any constitutionally declared hostility with a foreign enemy for nearly 80 years. The last constitutionally, meaning legally, declared war by the Congress occurred on the 4th of June, 1942. That was the date our nation wrapped the other Axis powers of Hungary and Romania in with Japan and Germany in World War II. Since then, the cowards in Washington, D.C. have not declared war, yet have sent our sons and daughters into battle without a formal declaration of war. The new aristocracy in our nation's capital have just pretended legislation far outside its constitutional limitations to commit our national treasure in conflicts that did not impact the homeland. They even played the same games when our country was actually attacked on our own soil on this 11th of September, 2001. It wasn't a formal declaration of war. So I would argue that the plus one is most assuredly one of those foreign enemies that an oath to the Constitution calls for people to protect and defend against. But is it the biggest, most threatening enemy? I'm not so sure, especially as it relates to our liberty. While the plus one terrorist and international criminal organizations are a huge threat to our safety and security here in the United States, there is an even bigger foreign enemy, because those organizations cannot accomplish major damage unless they are enabled by an even larger organization. What organization on the planet enables terrorist and criminal organizations, though? One that has the scale and scope to threaten not only the safety and security of our republic, but also the liberty of our people. I mean, it would have to have significant resources to enable terrorists and criminals to do that, right? In fact, this organization is so insidious that the taxpayers of the United States fund the activities it engages in, which are often contrary to the will of the people here in our republic. Now, just what organization could that be, you may be asking? Well, I'm referring to none other than the United Nations. That is a terrorist-enabling, child and human sex trafficking facility, dictator propping up organization whose biggest accomplishment is getting the American taxpayer to fund its anti-American, pro-subhuman savages supporting activities all over the world. In 2021 alone, the citizens of the United States provided a minimum of $12 billion to that criminal organization. While doing some research on that terror simp cabal that has its headquarters on American soil, one website had this description of the UN. It stated the United Nations is the world's main organization for deliberating matters of peace and security, but its work encompasses far more than peacekeeping and conflict prevention. Peace, security, peacekeeping, conflict prevention, my took us. I want you all to listen to this audio clip. While you listen to it, pay close attention to what you hear at the end. It's short, it's just a mere 30 plus seconds or so, but it provides the best example possible of what this organization actually represents. Here it is.
It's as follows. In favor, 88. Against, 55. Abstentions, 23. Having failed to obtain a two-thirds majority of members present and voting, draft amendment A/ES 10 L26 is not adopted.
Well, if you weren't actually paying attention to world events right now and still think the United Nations is a quote unquote force for good on this planet, or even investigated what A/ES-10L26 actually stated, that it was just voted down with loud applause, it would be just another vote in the UN to you. The cheerleaders for the UN would probably just think that something good happened. Let me tell you, though, that is definitely not the case. Let me share with you exactly what is contained in that amendment. A/ES-10L26 stated the following, quote, after operative paragraph 1, insert the following paragraph. Unequivocally rejects and condemns the terrorist attacks by Hamas that took place in Israel starting on 7 October 2023 and the taking of hostages, demands the safety, well-being, and humane treatment of the hostages in compliance with international law, and calls for the immediate and unconditional release, unquote. I cannot tell you just how much the video of that and listening to it makes my blood boil. But it just proves my point. Our nation's largest foreign enemy is the United Nations. Let's take a quick segment break before I come back with a bit more about the United Nations. Then we'll talk about an even more formidable enemy, the domestic enemy. And we're back. So, folks, if the United Nations were the organization that most people believe it to be, and people believe it to be that way mostly because they remain uneducated on what the UN is engaged in all over the planet, well, if that were the case, that resolution would have passed with unanimous consent. Instead, it fails to get the required 2/3 vote to pass. And the fact that when the amendment failed resulted in loud applause from a significant number of member countries present, that clearly demonstrates what that organization represents. It's anti-American, anti-Israel, pro-terrorist, pro-subhuman savage. Realize this as well. Most of the UN's operating funding comes from the American taxpayer. Not only that, this organization has its headquarters on and operates from American soil. The 4+1 identification of our nation's foreign enemies is really a smokescreen or a psyop developed by the central planners in our national government who work hand in glove with the global elitists that run the United Nations and the World Economic Forum. This smokescreen is designed to keep the average citizen's focus on the activities of those foreign nation states and the 4+1 foreign enemies or adversaries of the United States of America. But the foreign enemy is a much smaller threat to our liberty than the domestic enemy is. Why is that, you may ask? Well, the foreign enemy is nothing more than a tool used by the domestic enemy here at home. You can find examples of the domestic enemy and their actions in just about every news story floating around the ether today. Before I share some of those news stories with you, I want to go back to some amazing quotes from Thomas Jefferson so I can provide you with a clue as to who the domestic enemy is today. In a letter written all the way back in 1824, Thomas Jefferson had this to say, quote, I think myself that we have more machinery of government than is necessary. Too many parasites living on the labor of the industrious. Government big enough to supply everything you need is big enough to take everything you have. The course of history shows that as government grows, liberty decreases. The two enemies of the people are criminals and government. So let us tie the second down with the chains of the Constitution so the second will not become the legalized version of the first, unquote. Isn't that amazing that those words were written down in 1824? Just think about the difference in the size and scope of the central government that happened at that time in our nation's history compared to today. Or how about this quote, where Jefferson in 1854, he predicted the circumstances we see in our nation's capital today. He stated this quote, when all government, in little as in great things, shall be drawn to Washington as the center of power, it will render powerless the checks provided of one government on another, and it will be come as venal and oppressive as the government from which we separated, unquote. So what he's saying in that quote is that something that I've talked about on this program many times. If the citizens of this great republic were actually educated on our founding documents with a thorough study of the Declaration of Independence, everybody would see that the central planners in Washington, D.C. are committing many of the very same offenses that caused the 13 original colonies to declare their independence and fight a war to free themselves from the venal and oppressive government of the King of England. The new aristocracy has drawn all power in our nation to the District of Columbia. They have done this with laws passed outside of its enumerated powers, with amendments to the Constitution that has destroyed federalism, much like we discussed last week, and it is enabled by their useful idiots in the only institution that was granted a special carve-out for its freedoms and protections in our Constitution, the press. But the press isn't really the domestic enemy. Much like the United Nations, our biggest foreign enemy, is a tool for the domestic enemy, the same holds true for the press now. They are just a tool used to spread smokescreens or disinformation or to sow division and strife among the citizens. Some of that so-called free press is even taxpayer funded, like NPR. I came across this article the other day where it was reported that former television and now podcast personality Megyn Kelly, she called out NPR and that news organizations for reporting on the Gaza casualty reports. Casualty figures shared with the world by that famously honest organization, Hamas. Yep, that group of subhuman savages is a paragon of truth-telling, right? But just why would NPR use the casualty figures in the Gaza Strip as reported by Hamas in their reporting? Because it continues to fuel the narrative that the commies want the world to see and believe, that Israel is an occupation force and are killing indiscriminately in Gaza. That is just one of the many stories on the internet that supports and enables those subhuman, baby-killing savages of Hamas. Do you want to know what else serves as a useful tool for the biggest domestic enemy? Of course, it is academia. It was recently reported that more than 100 Columbia professors signed a letter defending the young skulls full of mush that show support for Hamas, and they further called on Ivy League schools officials to protect the students from the disturbing reverberations that are coming from their own statements in support of the jihadist subhuman savages that committed atrocities too awful to describe here on this program. Or now, how about this report that MSNBC host Joe Scarborough, who has a problem in the past with the death of one of his young interns many years ago, but Old Morning Joe is now on the record as blasting newly elected Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, for tying Israel aid to IRS funding cuts. Joe Scarborough uses his cable news legacy mainstream media platform to regularly bash President Trump and to push for big government intrusion into every facet of the lives of American citizens. He is definitely one of the pundits in the legacy media that Lenin, Marx, Stalin, and Hitler would be proud of. Here's another example of an organization that serves as a tool for the citizens' biggest domestic enemy, the National Organization for Women. This organization, originally founded in 1966, is the largest feminist organization in the United States with around 500,000 members. Its website states that it is a 501c3 that is devoted to achieving full equality for women through education and litigation. I guess that 500,000 members is not enough liberal feminists for them, because they have now gone on record at the end of last month as stating trans women are women. They must really need a large influx of membership dues to suddenly be willing to accept human beings with male genitalia as women. But that cultural and social contagion that is being enabled by the National Organization for Women and many other woke groups is just another tool for domestic enemy number one to use in their furtherance of their goals. How about another example of a tool that domestic enemy uses? We have discussed the climate crisis before, but there was another recent doomsday article in the Huffington Post that came out on Halloween. The article is breathlessly titled, "We've got less than 6 years left to avoid this crucial climate limit," scientists say. Oh no, only 6 years left this time. Just how much more in taxes and cost of living increases must the citizens of the United States have to pay to extend that doomsday timeline? You would think that by now there would be some new type of doomsday prediction that tools in the media would start using. I mean, I remember being told as a child that the planet was on the verge of another ice age. And according to Al Gore, the polar ice caps should have disappeared years ago. The same thing goes with the autistic child that is being abused and used by the media and her parents for their own personal gain, Greta Thunberg. These many doomsday predictions, along with the spread of disinformation and smokescreens, and the promotion and normalization of a social contagion, won't stop until we, the people, wake up and finally deal with domestic enemy number one. And just who would that be? Well, stay tuned for the closing segment coming up right after this break, and I will tell you all who or what the domestic enemy is. Most of you will not be surprised, though. And with that, we'll be right back. Well, folks, our time together this week is coming to a close. Before we close with God's Word, I'm going to reveal who I believe to be the biggest domestic enemy we face today. The enemy that was identified in the earliest years of our republic by the very men that fought for and often died for the liberty they wanted to ensure was passed along to all future generations of Americans. The enemy that uses the citizens to fund their attacks. The enemy, they're useful idiots in the media, academia, communist organizations, subhuman savages along with their sympathizers as tools to ensure they are successful in its fight against the liberty of the citizens. That enemy is none other than the government that was created to secure the people's liberty. At the root of nearly every news story we read today, and nearly everyone you can find on the internet today, we can all find our very own government behind the actions that are denying the citizens our rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. All it takes for you to see that is discernment. It takes people to look at everything our government is doing to us, not for us, with a questioning attitude. To follow every government program, law, regulation, spending, and revenue raising tool to its logical and often absurd conclusion. I find it amazing that O's for public and military service today still contain the phrase, all enemies, foreign and domestic. It must be some sort of archaic holdover, but most likely just a forgotten part of the O's. Plus, it's hard to imagine that our own government would be the biggest domestic enemy of the people, but it is true. Just look at every aspect of your lives where your rights are restricted. Freedom of movement, freedom of association, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom to peaceably assemble. And just who is restricting that? Your neighbor, your coworker, your cousin? No, it is the government we apathetically let get elected. The government the majority of Americans sit idly by and watch grow and intrude into every facet of our lives. There are ways to attack this enemy without shedding blood. At least at this point in time there is, which ties into God's word quite nicely. This week's wisdom from God's word comes to us from 1 Peter 5:8. Be sober-minded, be watchful. Your adversary, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion, seeking someone to devour. Our adversary has been allowed to flourish and grow because we have not been sober-minded or watchful. We've allowed the government to usurp the ballot box. But we can fix that by restoring integrity to our electoral process, returning to paper ballots and getting rid of the machines, getting rid of mail-in ballots, except for the cases of people indefinitely confined in hospitals or serving our nation overseas in public service in the military. Getting back to the constitutionally mandated election day instead of the current election season we have now. We can demand complete transparency from elected officials in how they work and vote on legislation. We can absolutely start imposing term limits as they were originally designed to be imposed at the ballot box. Those are just a few ways to begin defeating this enemy, but it requires all of us to participate in our system of self-governance. There cannot be any sitting on the sidelines wanting to be left alone anymore, because resistance to tyranny is obedience to God. Once again, thank you all for listening, and I pray you all enjoy the week and that you take a stand in the arena and get involved in the work necessary to restore our constitutional republic. Please don't forget to give this episode a thumbs up on YouTube, Rumble, or even TikTok. Until next week, stand in the arena with me. Reveille, it's time to wake up.